Scoreboard and also get some debugging information in your game. So I've currently got a game with two objects that are interacting. I'm going to start adding a score. This is sort of typically when you might want to add text, although you could do this at the very start of your game as well. The concepts we're going to need to be able to write content onto the canvas, and then we're going to need to know how to take information from our JavaScript objects and stick it into text, which is what we then put on the canvas. So first step, always we're just going to create a new file. I'm going to call this scoreboard.typescript. We could also just call it text. Mine's going to be kind of a double. It's going to both have debug information and scoreboard. You could do this as two objects if you wanted to. Lots of options here. So export const scoreboard. And then we're going to need a method to do the drawing. I'm going to call it write because I think of scoreboards as writing. And a scoreboard obviously is going to have a score. So I'll give it a score property. And then I'm going to have a debug mode property as well, which just says whether or not we're going to write our debug information. And maybe I'll go ahead and make write debug into its own method just for tidiness, so that the debug writing happens on its own. And then I'll say if this debug mode, write debug will be part of writing. All right. It's kind of the structure of my scoreboard. The scoreboard is going to need to import the context and the canvas so that it can actually write. And then the CTX has a very simple, there's a stroke text which would outline it, or I'm going to use fill text, which will fill the text in, and hopefully I get nice hinting. Fill text takes text in a string, so I'm just going to start with hello world just to prove I can do it. And then it takes an X and a Y, so I'll give it maybe 10 over and 50 down. And that should make my hello world set up as soon as I call this function. So I'll go ahead into my animate code, and I'm going to have to import my scoreboard object. And then in the write phase, I'm going to write it. And of course, if I write it first, my objects will draw over it. If I write it last, then it will draw on top. So it just depends where you want the score to show up. Actually, maybe I want the score to show up on top. So I'm going to go ahead and go scoreboard, write. All right, so now I see my hello world. It's kind of hard to read, so let's go ahead and change the font. There's just a font property, much like the fill color property. So if I go ahead and I do ctx.font equals, I'm going to just try 48 pixels Futura. You can Google this and read all about the different ways to specify fonts. That's a nice big font. And then let's just prove out I can do the debug. I could make in a different font. I'm going to go with 16 pixels Courier, which feels like computery. Hello debug world. Oops, that's not how that works. Fill text hello debug world, and we'll put that down at 10,100. All right, so the key lines here are these CTX fill text that takes a string and numbers, and then that just draws it on top. Beautiful. So the next thing to show you is how we use template strings in JavaScript. Template strings. So template strings, instead of the quotation mark, I can use these backticks. And if I just use the backticks with nothing else, they just work the same as quotes. So, okay, big whoop. A nice thing, you're allowed to hit return in the middle of a string with backticks if you want, and put as much space in there as you want. But more usefully, we're allowed to add JavaScript. So I could say, for example, score, and then I use $ and braces. And then anything in here is interpreted as JavaScript. So for example, I'm in this object, so I can say this.score, which will now show the score. And here in debug mode, I could say this.debug mode. Oops. If I forget the backticks, it just prints it as a string. If I change those quotes to backticks, I now get this .debug mode. So that's pretty cool. The debug gets even more handy if I go ahead and import my objects, for example. I can see how my objects work. So let's see. It's also nice with backticks. I can make as much space as I want. So I could do arrow.x. Oops, not this. Arrow.x. I can do arrow.y. If your things are decimals, they'll have an obnoxious number of decimal points. So I recommend using the toFixed method of numbers in JavaScript, which will let you choose how many decimals points you want to show. So there I can see it with a .y, which is nice. I can show how my target.y works. Target.y. Oh, target has no y. Sorry, target dot y center. So my target is a center of 250, and then it calculates out the y. Well, notice if our text gets too wide, it no longer all fits. So you have to actually make different calls to this for each new line. So I can do a fill text and put this one at 10, 140. It gets a little annoying that you have to do that, but works out okay. So now I can see how my target is moving and how my arrow is moving. Very nice. All right, so that's the kind of handy thing about debug mode. You can watch your values change in real time as your game is played. Now, if I want to actually update the score, that's just a property of an object. So all I need to do is assign to that property. So in my case, the collision is happening in my arrow code. I kind of need to know where that's happening. And so I'll have to just import my scoreboard object into my arrow code. And whenever the score is changing here, currently I was just logging it to the console. So like it shows you the score on the console there. But instead of doing that, I'm going to say scoreboard.score plus equals target.getScore arrow.y. Now this code is carefully set up to make sure it doesn't call this repeatedly when it hits. Otherwise, you'll score over and over. So here, I'm going to go ahead and shoot my arrow. And now when it hits my target, I get 5. I've got a whole score system with different points for the different rings. So if I hit a closer target, oop, I get the same. Let's see if I do better. I will get more points or less points depending. Although I currently seem only capable of hitting the 5. We'll see if I ever manage to hit something else. Oh, that's going to be better. There we go. All right, so that is the gist of how to set up a scoreboard. I now have a scoreboard object. It is writing all the time. Anytime I write to that score, it will update automatically on the screen. I also have this nice little debug mode. And if I wanted to go ahead and make it so you could turn off the debug mode, that's really easy. All I have to do is assign to the debug mode variable. So lots of ways I could do that. I already have a handlers here. So I could add a button and make a debug button. I'm going to just be very lazy and make it a secret. I'm going to use the fact there's a double click event. So if you double click, I'm going to say scoreboard debug mode equals not scoreboard debug mode. That's going to fail because I didn't import scoreboard. Go ahead and import scoreboard. All right, so now double clicking turns off and turns on. There you go. Anything else I wanted to track would just be a question of updating that scoreboard object with a new property. So for example, if I wanted to track the number of shots, I could do that by going to scoreboard, and I would say shot count 0. Here in the score, I would say score in this dot shot count shots. All right. And then there in my handlers, whenever we change the X, I would do scoreboard dot shot count plus equals 1. And now I get the number of shots. So if I keep clicking, it's going to show that I kept taking more shots. And I can see my average shot count. Obviously, you could also do math, calculations, anything you wanted to do. And if you don't want the debug information to show, you just set debug to false.